The blizzard arrived like a living thing, clawing at the door just as she raised her fist to knock. By the time he opened it, Snow and Fate had already decided neither of them would ever be the same again. Ethan Cole had learned to read storms the way other men read books. The sky's color, the way the wind leaned into the trees, the silence before the snow fell heavy and thick. He knew when to hurry the cattle, when to bring the children inside, when to bank the fire higher. But that Christmas Eve, the storm had moved faster than his knowing. It came roaring down from the mountains with a howl that rattled the beams of his porch and buried the valley in white before sundown. Inside the house, warmth fought bravely against the cold. A fire snapped and hissed in the stone hearth, filling the room with the scent of pine and smoke. The Christmas tree stood near the window, crooked but proud, decorated with paper stars his children had cut themselves and strings of dried berries threaded carefully by small hands. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. 3 identical blonde heads popped up from the rug when the knock came, sharp, desperate, almost lost beneath the wind. Noah, Luke, and Eli, 6 years old and inseparable, froze mid-whisper. "Did you hear that?" Luke asked, eyes wide. Ethan was already on his feet. No one came out in storms like this unless they had no choice. He grabbed his coat and crossed the room, each step heavy with a feeling he couldn't name yet. When he opened the door, the cold lunged inside, stealing the breath from his chest. She stood there trembling, snow clinging to her hair and lashes, a battered suitcase hanging from her numb fingers. Her dress was thin for winter, patched at the hem, and her boots were worn smooth at the soles. She looked young, too young to be standing alone in a blizzard, but her eyes carried a depth that told a longer story. "I'm sorry," she said, voice shaking, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "I didn't know where else to go." Before Ethan could answer, 3 small figures crowded behind him. "She's freezing," Noah whispered urgently. "And it's Christmas," Eli added, as if that alone settled everything. Luke tugged at Ethan's coat and whispered the words that would echo in his mind long after the storm passed. "Please let her stay." Ethan hesitated only a second, then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, "you'll freeze out there." She crossed the threshold like someone afraid the floor might vanish beneath her feet. The warmth hit her all at once, and her knees buckled. Ethan caught her before she fell, surprised by how light she was, by how quickly she started to cry once she realized she was safe. "I'm Clara," she managed between sobs. "Ethan," he replied quietly, "you're safe here." The boys stared at her as if she were something magical the storm had delivered just for them. They helped her out of her coat, guided her to the fire, offered her their own blankets without being asked. Within minutes, she was wrapped in warmth, a mug of hot tea trembling between her hands. Ethan watched from a distance, a strange tightness in his chest. His house had been quiet for years, not silent, never that with the boys, but empty in ways warmth couldn't touch. Their mother, Mary, had died giving birth to the twins, leaving Ethan with 3 newborns and a grief so sharp it had nearly broken him. Since then, the house had known routine, responsibility, love, but not softness. Clara's presence shifted something in the air, like a note added to a familiar song. Later, when the boys finally fell asleep in a heap near the fire, Clara told her story in halting pieces. She had been working as a seamstress in a nearby town, saving what little she could. When the factory closed, the rooms went next, then the patience of the people she relied on. She had heard of a farm in the valley that sometimes took in travelers for work, and she had set out before the storm was supposed to hit. "But I was too slow," she said softly, staring into the flames, "and the storm didn't wait." "You can stay," Ethan said before thinking too much about it, "at least until the road's clear." Her eyes filled again, but this time her smile came with the tears. "Thank you." The storm raged for 2 days. Snow buried fences and swallowed paths, turning the world into something quiet and endless. Clara stayed. She helped where she could, mending clothes, cooking meals that somehow tasted warmer than the ones Ethan had made for years. The boys followed her like ducklings, enchanted by the way she listened, by how she laughed at their jokes, by the gentleness in her hands. Ethan tried to keep his distance. He told himself she was a guest, that kindness didn't have to mean more. But at night, after everyone else slept, he found himself sitting at the table, listening to the wind, thinking about the sound of her voice. When the roads finally cleared, Clara stood at the door with her suitcase again. The boys clung to her skirts, refusing to let go. "You can't leave," Noah said fiercely. "Please stay," Luke begged. Eli looked up at Ethan, eyes serious beyond his years. "We need her." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked at Clara, saw the hope she was trying not to show. "You don't have to go," he said slowly. "If you want, there's work here, a place." Her answer was a whisper, "I want to stay." Winter deepened, and Clara became part of the rhythm of the house. She learned the farm, the stubborn mule, the way Ethan liked his coffee strong and quiet. Ethan learned the sound of her humming while she worked, the way she stood at the window when she thought no one was watching, missing a life she hadn't had the chance to keep. The boys thrived. They laughed louder, slept easier, argued less. The house filled with things Ethan hadn't realized were missing, songs, stories, warmth that went beyond the fire. But happiness, Ethan knew, was a fragile thing. When spring came, so did whispers. People in the valley noticed Clara, noticed the way she lived under Ethan's roof without a ring on her finger. They talked the way people always did, with certainty born of distance. Clara heard them too. One evening she stood at the door again, suitcase in hand, eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. "For you, for the boys." Ethan felt the old fear rise, loss, sudden and cruel. "You're not trouble," he said, voice rough. "You're family." The word hung between them, fragile and powerful. The boys appeared, drawn by the tension. "You promised," Luke said softly. Clara knelt and hugged them, holding on like she might never let go. Then she stood and looked at Ethan, really looked at him. "Then don't let me walk away," she said. He didn't. By the next Christmas, snow fell gently, not as a threat but as a blessing. The tree stood taller this year, decorated with new ornaments and old memories. Clara stood beside Ethan, the boys pressed close. Laughter filling every corner of the house. Outside, the storm stayed far away. And Ethan understood, finally, that some blizzards don't come to destroy. They come to deliver what you never knew you were missing. The second blizzard came a year later, softer in sound but heavier in meaning, and this time it did not arrive at the door, it settled inside their lives. Snow fell steadily the morning Clara realized something was wrong. She stood at the kitchen table, hands resting on the wood, staring at the window as if the answer might be written in the sky. Ethan noticed before she said a word. He always noticed. Love had sharpened him in ways grief never had. "You're quiet," he said gently. She turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just tired. But Clara was not just tired. Over the months since she stayed, the valley had slowly accepted her. Not fully, it never fully accepted anyone new, but enough that the whispers faded into the background hum of life. She worked hard, earned respect, became indispensable not only to the house but to the boys' hearts. They called her Mama Clara without thinking, without realizing the weight of the word. She never corrected them. Yet joy has a way of awakening old fears. That afternoon, when the boys were outside building a crooked snowman and Ethan was fixing a hinge in the barn, Clara felt the sickness rise again. This time, she knew. Her knees gave way and she sank onto the bed, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other to her stomach. The truth terrified her. She had lived her whole life learning how quickly stability could vanish. A job lost, a door closed, a storm that came too soon. And now she carried something fragile inside her, something that could change everything again. When Ethan came in that evening, shaking snow from his coat, he found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames the way she had that first night. "Clara," he said quietly, "what is it?" She looked up, eyes shining with fear and hope tangled together. "I think I'm with child." The word struck him like a sudden silence after thunder. He sat down slowly, as if afraid to move too fast and break something sacred. In his mind, images collided: Mary's smile, her death, the tiny cries of newborns, and the unbearable terror of almost losing them too. Pain rose, sharp and old. But then he looked at Clara. She was trembling, not from fear of him, but fear of the future, fear that she had dared to believe happiness might stay. He reached for her hands. "We'll be all right," he said, though his voice wavered. "We've survived worse than this." Her tears fell freely then, soaking into his sleeves as she leaned into him. "I didn't plan this," she whispered, "but I already love this child." "So do I," he said, surprising himself with the certainty of it. When they told the boys, the reaction was instant and overwhelming. "A baby," Noah shouted, eyes lighting up. "Can I teach it to read?" Luke asked. Eli simply wrapped his arms around Clara's waist and said, "It can sleep in my room." Laughter filled the house, chasing away the shadows that had crept in with fear. But life, as Ethan knew too well, never tested love only once. The winter grew harsher than expected. Supplies ran low. Clara's strength waned as her body worked harder each day. Some nights she lay awake, breath shallow, while Ethan sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to the wind as if daring it to take anything else from him. The valley doctor came when he could, his face always serious, always cautious. "She's strong," he said once, "but childbirth is never certain, especially in winter." Those words carved themselves into Ethan's heart. One night near Christmas, the storm returned with a fury that reminded Ethan too much of the past. Snow piled high, cutting them off completely. The boys slept uneasily, sensing the tension even through dreams. Clara went into labor just after midnight. Pain tore through her like lightning, stealing her breath. Ethan moved on instinct, his hands steady even as his heart pounded. He boiled water, laid out cloths, whispered prayers he hadn't spoken since Mary died. Hours passed. The storm screamed outside, battering the house as if demanding entry. "I'm afraid," Clara cried, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I won't leave you." The boys huddled at the bedroom door, eyes wide and wet with fear. Ethan tried to send them back to bed, but they refused. "We stay," Eli said quietly, "like you stayed for Mama Clara." Near dawn, as the storm began to tire itself out, a thin cry pierced the room. "Life." Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Ethan held the tiny, squalling baby in his arms. A girl, dark-haired, with Clara's mouth and Ethan's stubborn chin. The doctor arrived hours later, shaking his head in amazement. "You were lucky," he said simply. Ethan knew better. Luck had nothing to do with it. Love had fought for them. They named her Grace. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. The boys grew taller, louder, protective. Grace learned to walk between the same walls where her brothers had once crawled. Clara's laughter returned stronger, steadier. Ethan learned to rest, to trust that happiness could be built and rebuilt, even after loss. One evening, many winters later, snow fell gently again. Ethan stood on the porch, watching his children, all four of them now, race through the white, their laughter echoing across the valley. Clara joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you ever think about that first storm?" she asked. "All the time," he said. "If it hadn't come, if you hadn't knocked." She smiled softly. Then none of this would exist. Inside, the house glowed warm and bright, filled with voices and memories layered thick as snowfall. Some storms destroy homes. Others build them. And Ethan Cole knew, as he closed the door against the cold, that the blizzard which once brought a stranger to his door had, in truth, brought him the life he was always meant to live.